you can keep those from being recognized, and you don't end up with a situation where a cleverly crafted input can get past your filter, because anything that would need to apply one of the production rules that you got rid of in order to be parsed will be rejected completely. But you have to match the computational strength of your input language.
Match or be stronger than.
Match or be stronger than, but it's really preferable to match it exactly. Okay, so we
injection attacks against your grammar verifier, they're just embarrassing.
Yeah. Question?
A lot of languages need to be written by humans, HTML and CSS do, and they can't just reject things. Instead, the CSS specification and HTML4 didn't, but HTML5 does specify what browsers need to do in error cases, and that makes it harder to do what you're recommending, to have the serializer and the parser use the same code based on that grammar.
Are we talking about the restricted sublanguage stuff, or are we talking about just in general?
In general.
Well, so I mean, if you're, I don't see any reason not to use the same parser code but have different hooks. Because if you treat parsing as validation, as simply the recognition of whether, is this actually a valid string in the language that the parser is for? That's really the first question that any parser has to answer, and a serializer has to generate a string that is valid in that language. I mean, generation is really just parsing backwards.
The HTML5, every string creates some DOM.
Sure. Maybe we should take this offline because I'm not sure I follow what you're saying. All right, so 3 general classes of attacks: ambiguity, nonsense, and confused deputy. Ambiguity we see a lot in the English language as well. There are some really hilarious lists of headlines that parse differently.
British push bottles up, German something.
Rear.
Yeah, it's the headline.
Yeah, from World War II. The British the British surged into wherever it was they were fighting the Germans, and they overtook them from behind and bottlenecked them in one place. So British push, bottles up, German rear. Nonsense attacks are when you basically throw semantically meaningless bullshit that just happens to parse at an underspecified language, and see what you can get the implementation to do.
A lot of fuzzing falls into this class.
Yeah, fuzzing generally tends to be nonsense attacks, and
even smart fuzzing, though, that also takes advantage of ambiguity and confused deputy as well. But
yeah,
the original definition of fuzzing, the dumb, let's just throw junk at this until it rolls over and says, fuck me. That's a nonsense attack.
And confused deputy attacks. These actually got their name in the capabilities world. Blanking on the name of the guy that came up with them, but Norm Hardy, thank you, Brian. Yeah, pretty much everybody ignored them.
It's capabilities, right? It's not worth paying attention to. But we'll take the terminology because
it happens to be the case that cross-site request forgery is a confused deputy attack. The idea here is that because you've got an embedding someplace that it's not supposed to be, whatever entity that you've delegated some authority that you have to doesn't realize that embedding is not where it's supposed to be, and not even supposed to be there in the first place, and just goes ahead and does stuff with it because it thinks it's doing the right thing. So it makes sense that this would come from capabilities, because they're all about making that not happen. They're all about keeping things nicely locked up in their own special corners. Okay, so we can see ambiguity in different places, not just between input and output, but also between the internal states of implementations. integer overflow attack that we described earlier was an example of an ambiguity attack. It was syntactically valid in both dialects. The parsers were in fact different. It's also semantically valid, but what the sender intended and what the receiver understood, the semantic content, the data, if you will, those will differ between implementations in an ambiguity attack. These are kind of they can be a little difficult to identify because you have to have a really solid understanding not just of the grammar that you're dealing with, but also the back-end state. Yeah, so it's not enough just to have the TCP packet specification down in your head. You also have to be thinking about, okay, well, what happens if I throw out weird stuff in a state? What happens if I throw out a totally valid packet from a state that packet shouldn't be sent from? However, once you locate the place where a misunderstanding will occur, the path forward is usually pretty obvious. Nonsense attacks, on the other hand, are going to be syntactically valid but semantically meaningless. Classic example of this is the good old-fashioned TCP Christmas tree packet. If you're in a listen state and you receive a packet with the SYN flag set, that makes sense.
Let's point out that that's syntactically valid from the point of view of the parser, not from the point of view of the protocol. Obviously, anything that's not syntactically valid is just going to be rejected. However, you can get syntactically invalid, according to the protocol, packets through an implementation if it mistakenly takes them as syntactically valid. Just a point of clarification.
Yeah. I mean, the specification, the TCP RFC actually doesn't say anything about, well, what happens if you light up every flag. There are some mentions of like, well, okay, you're only supposed to send SYN at this point, and if you're sending that, if you've got the SYN flag set, that's probably not right. And you know, but it doesn't specifically say that if you get if you get a set of flags that are not valid for whatever state you're in, you know, that you should. You know, it doesn't say what to do with it.
Here's where I'll take the opportunity to define Postel's law for those of you who didn't know it. It's be conservative in what you generate, but liberal in what you accept. Now, RFCs that don't specify what you should do when bad stuff is generated are probably written by people who are strongly thinking that this isn't going to happen, because that's a Christmas tree packet is obviously not a conservatively generated packet. However, Postel's law was formulated in an era before worrying about what somebody who wants to fuck shit up on the internet is going to do became an actually, valid driver for design requirements. These days it is, but we're still in the mindset of, well, the implementations will figure it out themselves. And on the flip side, the be liberal in what you accept basically says, have your implementation speak multiple dialects that might conflict, because it's better than incompatibility.
Now, it's important to observe here that when you have these kinds of variations between how different implementations handle nonsense input, you can actually use that for fingerprinting. I mean, that's what Nmap does. So here's another nonsensical example with PKCS1. So back in 2006...
The padding for signatures with S-MIME and so forth.
Right. So back in 2006, Daniel Bleckenbacher shows up at Crypto out in Santa Barbara and proceeds to explain how he could forge RSA signatures. So an RSA signature is supposed to be padded with FFs out to the width of the modulus. So you've got the signature, but the entire thing needs to be as long as the modulus is, and whatever's not actually data just gets padded with well, it's 0, 0, then 0, 1, then a bunch of FFs. So what he was doing was shrinking the padding bytes, because after the padding bytes comes an algorithm identifier and then the hash. So what he was doing was shrinking the padding bytes and adding a bunch of extra shit after the hash, such that the tail end resolved to a signature that was valid, that was quote unquote valid, but not actually, but had not actually been signed by the right key. I mean, happily this only worked for small moduluses.
Because he adds enough garbage that the resulting signature is to the power of the exponent in such a way that you can actually then use E to factor it. So you wind up with a cube of what you originally had, and that's going to be handled by most implementations of RSA. E equals 5 might be, if you're able to handle, I can't do the math, it's a 5-figure long RSA key. There are some implementations that handle that, but E to the...
So 2 to the 16th minus 1.
2 to the 16th minus 1. That you're not going to ever run into trouble with in this case. But the problem here had to do with the parsing of the pattern. Again,
really what was happening was it was a length field mismatch. You're supposed to have the length of the padding is supposed to be dependent on the length of the hash and the length of the and the width of the modulus. This is something that could have been represented with a context-sensitive grammar. So we could have done context-sensitive parse tree comparison.
In fact, we did.
Yeah, that was in fact what prompted us to extend the context-free work that I did back in 2005 to the context-sensitive languages. But
we implemented the parser that validated that the padding was correct, and tried to get the exploit through on vulnerable code. But in our case, even though the padding parser that is in OpenSSL was broken, and also NSS, we were able to stop that code from getting to that point. So this approach, if it's actually implemented correctly, allows you to have broken, buggy, attackable code that can't be reached by the attacker in most traditional means. This particular example shows that it's not just, so all the X11 attacks we did were all pretty much not crypto attacks. We left the crypto alone. This one is one where it's both a file format and a crypto attack, because you've got to know some properties about RSA in order to be able to leverage the mistaken parsing of the padding in order to get yourself what appears to be a valid RSA signature. So again, this is an example of why we're not picking out specific, recipes for forming attacks. You've got to use you've got to look at whatever case you find, where you find weaknesses, and be creative. Figure out what's being given to you here and how you can leverage it.
all right, so cross-site request forgery and its friends. So you've got some web application. As we said earlier, the set of operations that make up the web application is going to be a restricted sublanguage of HTTP. The input alphabet is smaller, it's got fewer states, fewer transitions. However, it does still have all of the same tokens that, that are available to HTTP, but if you have them and don't use them, it's like not having them at all. The refer header is the one that matters for cross-site request forgery. If you're ignoring refer headers, you are reducing the strength of your validator because you are dropping the context.